On what seemed like just another routine flight, a tense and uncomfortable drama unfolded between a mother and her disrespectful son in economy class. As the situation spiraled, passengers grew uneasy, but one unexpected figure from first class decided to intervene. What happened next left everyone stunned. Welcome to Stories That Heal, where today we uncover how Barron turned a moment of family conflict into a powerful lesson in compassion. The cabin of the flight buzzed with the typical pre-departure chaos. Passengers wrestled with carry-on luggage, children squirmed in their seats, and flight attendants navigated the narrow aisles with practiced precision, offering polite smiles and directions. Amidst this orchestrated disorder, an elderly woman with a slight hunch and a soft, dignified air made her way slowly down the aisle. Her movements were careful, her small frame unsteady, as she clutched a worn leather handbag and a carry-on that seemed far too heavy for her. Trailing behind her was a middle-aged man, his crisp business suit slightly rumpled, his impatience barely concealed. He held a sleek briefcase in one hand and scrolled through his phone with the other, ignoring his mother's struggles as she attempted to stow her carry-on in the overhead bin. The woman's frailty was evident, and her efforts to lift the bag were clearly in vain. She glanced back at her son, her eyes silently pleading for help. "Do you need me to do everything for you?" he snapped, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. His tone was sharp, dripping with exasperation. A hush fell over the surrounding rows as heads turned toward the commotion. The elderly woman flinched, her cheeks coloring in embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Michael. I didn't mean—" "Just sit down," he interrupted, roughly taking the bag from her hands and shoving it into the compartment. The gesture, though functional, lacked any semblance of kindness. He then slumped into the aisle seat, his irritation palpable as he muttered under his breath. The woman hesitated before settling into the middle seat, her movement slow and deliberate. Her eyes darted around the cabin, catching the concerned gazes of strangers. She offered them a faint, apologetic smile before lowering her head. In the row behind them, a young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman leaned over and whispered to her partner, "Did you hear the way he spoke to her? That's his mother." "Yeah," the man replied, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." A few rows away, a flight attendant observed the scene, her professional demeanor faltering momentarily as she caught the tension. She approached with a polite smile. "Is everything all right here?" Michael looked up from his phone, his expression one of thinly veiled annoyance. "Yes, everything's fine," he said curtly. "Can we just get going?" The flight attendant hesitated, her gaze shifting to the elderly woman, who offered a quiet nod. "We're fine, dear," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. The attendant lingered for a moment before nodding and stepping away. As the plane began to taxi, the tension in the row seemed to thicken. Michael scrolled through his phone with the air of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. His mother, meanwhile, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid, and her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but in their corner of the plane, the silence felt heavy. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, Michael's irritation resurfaced. The elderly woman leaned slightly toward him. "Michael, I was wondering—" "What now, Mom?" he snapped, cutting her off. His voice was louder this time, drawing the attention of more passengers. "Can't you just sit quietly for a while?" She recoiled as if struck, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the scarf around her neck. "I just thought maybe I could recline my seat a little," she said hesitantly. Michael let out a harsh laugh, his incredulity echoing in the cabin. "Recline? Are you serious? You'll crush the person behind you. Why don't you think about someone else for once?" A murmur rippled through the nearby rows as passengers exchanged incredulous looks. The woman behind them, seated in the middle seat, leaned forward and tapped Michael on the shoulder. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her tone edged with disapproval. "There's no issue if she reclines her seat. You don't need to speak to her like that. Michael turned to face her, his expression a mix of annoyance and defiance. Mind your own business, he retorted. This is between me and my mother. The woman sat back, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her glare remained fixed on him. The elderly woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face a picture of quiet shame. It's all right, she murmured. I won't recline. At that moment, seated in first class, Baron Trump observed the scene unfold. His tall frame was relaxed, and his demeanor was one of quiet attentiveness as he flipped through a book. Yet, his sharp eyes flicked up when he caught the raised voices. Though his usual preference was to keep to himself, something about the interaction in the back caught his attention. He set the book down and leaned slightly into the aisle, watching intently. A few minutes later, Barron pressed the call button, summoning a flight attendant. As she arrived, he gestured toward the back of the plane. "What's going on back there?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The flight attendant hesitated, unsure how much to disclose. "It seems there's a disagreement between a passenger and his mother," she said diplomatically. "We're keeping an eye on it." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Let me know if it gets worse," he said simply, picking up his book again. But the furrow in his brow suggested he was already contemplating his next move. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin only seemed to grow. Michael's dismissive and harsh tone toward his mother became increasingly difficult for nearby passengers to ignore. Some exchanged whispers. Others shot him disapproving glances, but no one seemed willing to step in. The elderly woman, visibly wilting under her son's disdain, made herself as small as possible in her seat, her hands gripping the armrest tightly as if trying to anchor herself against the tide of humiliation. From his vantage point in first class, Baron Trump couldn't shake what he had witnessed. Though his outward expression remained composed, his mind was racing. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone mistreated, but there was something particularly jarring about watching a man show such little respect for his own mother. He closed his book and sat back in his seat, his thoughts churning as he tried to decide whether to act. Meanwhile, the situation in economy class escalated further. The elderly woman reached into her bag and retrieved a small thermos. "I brought some tea," she said softly to Michael, her tone tinged with hopeful anticipation. "Would you like some?" Michael let out an audible groan, throwing his head back against the seat. "Tea? No, Mom, I don't want tea," he snapped, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Why do you always have to be so annoying? Just sit there and stop bothering me." A gasp escaped from one of the passengers seated nearby, a young mother traveling with her toddler. She leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Can you believe this guy? Talking to his own mother like that?" Her husband shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's disgusting," he murmured. "Someone should say something." The elderly woman lowered her thermos, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to mask her hurt with a faint smile, but her eyes betrayed her. "I'm sorry, Michael," she whispered. "I just thought—" "Stop!" Michael interrupted, his voice sharp. "Just stop talking." The flight attendant who had spoken to Barron earlier now approached Michael's row again. Her professionalism strained as she addressed him. "Sir," she said firmly but politely, "I need to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing the other passengers." Michael's eyes narrowed and he leaned toward her, his irritation palpable. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said with mock sweetness. "Am I disturbing people by having a conversation with my mother?" "It's not just a conversation," the flight attendant replied, her tone unwavering. "Please keep your voice down and treat her with respect. If this continues, I'll have to escalate the matter." Michael rolled his eyes and sank back into his seat, muttering something under his breath. The flight attendant turned her attention to the elderly woman, offering her a kind smile. "Ma'am, is there anything I can get for you?" The woman shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, thank you. I'm fine." The flight attendant nodded and walked away, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Passengers whispered among themselves, their frustration with Michael growing. In first class, Barron observed everything, his jaw tightening as he made his decision. Without a word, he rose from his seat, his tall frame drawing attention as he moved down the aisle. Heads turned as passengers recognized him, their curiosity piqued. Barron made his way toward the back of the plane, his steps purposeful yet calm. He stopped at Michael's row, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Excuse me," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. "I couldn't help but notice the way you've been speaking to your mother." Michael looked up, startled by the unexpected confrontation. He blinked, clearly recognizing Barron but momentarily at a loss for words. "What are you talking about?" he said finally, his tone defensive. "I'm talking about respect," Barron replied, his gaze unwavering. "The way you're treating her is unacceptable." Michael scoffed, attempting to mask his discomfort with bravado. "And who are you to tell me how to talk to my mother?" "I'm someone who recognizes when a person deserves better," Barron said evenly, his tone carrying an authority that belied his years. "And right now, you're not giving her what she deserves." The elderly woman looked up at Barron, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Young man," she began, her voice trembling, "you don't have to—" "It's okay," Barron interrupted gently, turning to her with a reassuring smile. "You shouldn't have to put up with this." Michael's face reddened, a mixture of embarrassment and anger flaring in his expression. "Look, this is none of your business," he said, his voice rising again. "You don't know anything about us." "I know enough," Barron replied, his calm demeanor unshaken. "And everyone here can see how you're behaving. Maybe it's time you think about why that is." A murmur of agreement rippled through the nearby rows. Passengers who had been silent up to this point now found their voices, nodding and whispering their support. The young mother from earlier leaned forward and said, "He's right. You've been out of line this whole flight." Michael glared at her, then at Barron, his frustration boiling over. "You people have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped. "Just leave us alone." Barron's expression softened, but his resolve remained firm. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't know your story, but I do know that kindness costs nothing. And if there's one person in this world who deserves your kindness, it's the woman sitting next to you." Michael faltered, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort. Finally, he slumped back in his seat, crossing his arms and glaring out the window. The tension in the row began to dissipate as Barron turned his attention back to the elderly woman. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "if there's anything you need during the flight, please let me know. I'd be happy to help." The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she nodded, her gratitude palpable. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's very kind of you." Barron nodded, offering her a small smile before turning to make his way back to first class. As he passed through the aisle, passengers nodded at him, some even clapping softly in a show of support. Barron returned to his seat, picking up his book once more, but the cabin remained abuzz with the impact of his intervention. For the rest of the flight, Michael sat in silence, his earlier bravado subdued. The elderly woman, though still quiet, seemed lighter, her posture less tense. The small act of standing up for her had shifted the mood of the entire plane, proving once again that even in moments of conflict, compassion could make all the difference. The remainder of the flight settled into a quieter rhythm, but the emotional ripples from Barron's intervention continued to flow through the cabin. Passengers exchanged knowing looks and hushed conversations, their respect for the young man evident in their glances. Barron sat back in his seat, his book open in his hands, though he found himself unable to focus on the words. The echoes of the elderly woman's gratitude lingered in his mind. Back in economy class, Michael's demeanor remained visibly altered. His earlier arrogance had given way to a sullen silence. Occasionally, he would glance sideways at his mother, his expression flickering between guilt and frustration. The older woman, though still reserved, exuded a subtle strength now, as if the simple act of being defended had restored some of her dignity. A flight attendant passed by their row and leaned in toward the elderly woman. "Ma'am, would you like a drink or anything else? It's on the house," she offered warmly. The woman smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Thank you, dear," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I'm fine." The flight attendant gave her a reassuring nod and moved on. Michael watched the interaction with an expression that was hard to decipher. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence. "Mom," he said awkwardly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the engines. I didn't mean to." She turned to him, her gaze soft but weary. "Michael," she interrupted gently, "I've always forgiven you, even when you didn't ask for it. But you need to think about how your words affect others. Not just me, but everyone." Michael looked down at his hands, shame creeping into his features. He muttered something inaudible, and the elderly woman sighed, resting a hand on his arm. "It's not too late to change, you know," she said softly. "You can always do better." Their quiet exchange didn't go unnoticed by the passengers around them. The young mother with the toddler smiled softly, nudging her husband. "Maybe he's finally learning something," she whispered. Meanwhile, up in first class, the murmurs of conversation continued to center around Barron's gesture. A middle-aged man seated across from him leaned over, his curiosity overriding his earlier reluctance to speak. "That was quite a thing you did back there," he said, his tone a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Most people wouldn't have gotten involved." Barron glanced up from his book, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I just did what felt right," he said simply. "Sometimes people need to see that someone's willing to stand up for them." The man nodded, clearly impressed. "It's rare to see someone your age with that kind of courage," he remarked. "You've got a good head on your shoulders." Barron gave a small smile, nodding in acknowledgement, before returning to his book. He didn't seek praise or validation for what he had done. He simply felt it was the right thing to do. As the flight neared its destination, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent descent. Passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. Despite the usual flurry of activity, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tinged with the impact of the earlier events. Michael turned to his mother once more as the plane began its descent. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said again, this time with more sincerity. "I'll try to do better." The elderly woman placed a hand over his, squeezing it gently. "That's all I've ever wanted," she replied, her voice filled with quiet hope. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, a subtle sense of unity seemed to fill the air. Passengers moved deliberately, allowing one another space and exchanging brief smiles as they retrieved their bags. In first class, Barron waited patiently for his turn to disembark, his expression as composed as ever. Before leaving, the elderly woman made her way up the aisle, her steps slow but determined. She stopped by Barron's seat, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "What you did today, it meant more than I can put into words." Barron stood, towering over her but exuding nothing but warmth. "You didn't deserve to be treated that way," he replied simply. "I'm glad I could help." The passengers around them watched the exchange, their admiration for Barron evident in their expressions. As the elderly woman returned to her son, who had lingered at the front of the plane, she gave Barron one final nod of appreciation. As Barron stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, he reflected on the day's events. He knew the world was filled with challenges and injustices, but he also believed in the power of small actions to make a difference. Today, he had seen that belief in action, and it reaffirmed his commitment to being a force for good wherever he could. Passengers from the flight continued to talk about the young man who had stood up for a stranger. Some snapped photos discreetly, hoping to remember the rare display of courage and kindness they had witnessed. For those who had been on board, it wasn't just another flight. It was a moment that reminded them of the impact one person could have when they chose to act with compassion. As the passengers filed into the terminal, the atmosphere seemed lighter than usual, almost as if the events on the plane had left an imprint on everyone's mood. Barron walked calmly through the crowd, his tall figure unmistakable yet unassuming. A few people recognized him, whispering among themselves, but he remained focused, blending into the flow of travelers. The elderly woman, her son Michael now trailing behind her with their luggage, caught up with Barron near the baggage claim. She tapped his arm gently, and when he turned, she smiled with a mix of gratitude and newfound confidence. "You know," she began, her voice soft yet steady, "what you did back there wasn't just about me. It made my son see things he hadn't before. For that, I owe you more than I can ever say." Barron gave her a reassuring smile. "Sometimes people just need a little nudge to see things differently," he said. "I'm glad it made a difference for both of you." Michael stepped forward awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice subdued but genuine. "I was wrong about everything. You didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway. So, uh, thanks." Barron nodded, offering a handshake. Michael hesitated for a moment, then took it, the gesture marking a quiet truce. "Take care of your mom," Barron said firmly but kindly. "She deserves that." Michael nodded again, this time with a hint of determination. As they moved to collect their bags, Barron stepped aside, watching as the two walked away together, their dynamic visibly changed. Nearby, a young woman with a toddler approached Barron, her face lit with admiration. "I just wanted to say," she said, shifting her child on her hip, "what you did today was amazing. It's rare to see someone step in like that." Barron looked slightly embarrassed but smiled politely. "Thank you," he said. "I just hope it inspires people to do the same when they see someone who needs help." The woman nodded. "It already has," she replied, before walking off with her child. As Barron waited for his luggage, the flight's captain approached him, his uniform immaculate, but his demeanor relaxed. "Young man," he said, extending a hand, "I've been flying for decades, and I've seen all sorts of people on my flights. But what you did today, it was something special. You reminded us all of what it means to care for one another." Barron shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I think we all have a responsibility to look out for each other." The captain smiled warmly. "Well said," he replied. "You've got a bright future ahead of you." As the captain walked away, Barron finally retrieved his bag and made his way toward the exit. Outside, the crisp air greeted him, a welcome contrast to the confined space of the plane. His security detail fell into step behind him, maintaining their discreet distance. Before getting into his car, Barron paused, taking a moment to reflect. The events of the day had started as a simple flight but had unfolded into something far more meaningful. He hadn't set out to make an impact, but his choice to act had resonated deeply with those around him. As he settled into the back seat, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news article, already circulating about the mysterious young man on the flight who had stood up for an elderly woman. Barron shook his head with a small smile, setting the phone aside. He didn't need recognition or praise. What mattered was that a woman had found her voice, a son had seen his mother's worth, and perhaps a few passengers had been reminded of the power of empathy. For Barron, that was enough. As the car pulled away from the curb, the terminal behind him bustling with life, Barron gazed out the window, quietly resolved to carry this lesson with him wherever he went. Life was full of opportunities to make a difference, and today, he had seized one. Barron Trump's intervention wasn't just a gesture. It was a reminder that kindness can ripple through even the most challenging moments. The mother's tearful gratitude, the son's quiet reflection, and the newfound camaraderie among passengers spoke volumes about the impact of empathy. As we leave you with this powerful story, remember to always look for ways to uplift those around you. Thank you for watching Stories That Heal. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.